Penance Brand of Dissipation Slayer is probably the best boss killer build I've ever played. It achieves levels of damage normally only seen by ZHP builds, while being remarkably tanky for the level of damage it has, and for the relative level of investment I have in the character. But there's a lot of caveats to that statement, one of them being it's incredibly mechanically complex to build, and another being that while it is cheap relative to the performance, it's not cheap in an objective sense. Though of course prices are constantly changing, so who knows, maybe when you're watching this video 5 years after I made it, it's one of the cheapest builds and only costs you a couple chaos and items off the floor. Before Affliction League started, I said I wanted to play Penance Brand, and my original thought was a Penance Brand Ignite Elementalist, something that I'm definitely still going to play at some point in the future. With all the new Transfigure gems, I couldn't not play Penance Brand of Dissipation. Look, I could. I did try Penance Brand of Conduction, but that didn't exactly turn out the way I wanted it to. And Penance Brand of Dissipation is everything that I wanted Penance Brand of Conduction to be, and then some more. So I've now killed all of the Uber bosses, done multiple tier 17 maps, and min-maxed this character far harder than it probably needed to be. But I've definitely enjoyed the build making puzzle, and so get comfortable because that means the key mechanics are a bit longer than usual. And if you plan to play this build, they are really, really, really important. I can't stress that enough. Don't skip this, otherwise your build's probably going to suck. And if you want to see a little bit more practical application of a build, such as melting Uber bosses to see which ones are the most profitable, don't worry, I'll be doing that in the future, so get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, and for now, let's get into those key mechanics. First up, I'm a power charge stacker using Ralakeshes. I combine Ralakesh with Badge of Brotherhood, so my maximum power also applies to my maximum frenzy. Now, instead of being a power charge stacker, I'm a power frenzy charge stacker. And as a Slayer of Masterful Form, now maximum power charges applies to both frenzy and endurance. Therefore, I'm an omni-charge build, and I don't actually have to worry about to maximum frenzy or maximum endurance while still getting all the benefits. This is why I'm playing Penance Brand of Dissipation on a Slayer, as opposed to something like an Occultist, Trickster, or Inquisitor. This gives me access to a massive amount of physical damage reduction that scales with my damage. I have most of the uniques that you'd expect, combining Ralakesh's Impatience, Malachi's Loop, Badge of Brotherhood, and Restless Ward, or more accurately the replica version, plus I'm using a Void Battery for my weapon since I needed one more power charge there. Then I'm stacking as many bonuses as I can, which also scale off of my power charges for maximum damage. That's part of why the ceiling for this build is incredibly high. If you're playing it on standard where +2 power charge rings still exist, then the ceiling would be even higher, but I'm not doing that, nor do I have any intentions to in the future. So power charges more or less solve my damage, but what about defenses? That's where things get pretty difficult. If you've looked at Pewee Ninja, you'll see that a lot of a Penance Brand of Dissipation builds are super squishy. Part of this is because some of them are Sanctum runners. Part of this is because you can legitimately get enough damage to insta-kill non-phased Uber bosses. But you're going to have some problems in tier 17 maps if you're a complete glass cannon. Admittedly, even if you're super tanky, some of the maps are just mean and will still give you issues. So I wanted something that was well-rounded enough that I could do some of the tier 17 maps. Thus, I started by adding extra elemental defenses using a Mage Blood. This gives me permanent Topaz, Ruby, and Sapphire Flask uptime for about 40% less elemental damage taken. Not only is this unaffected by enemy penetration, but it means I don't have to stack maximum resistances. There are also alternatives, of course, such as Fizz taken as or Ellie taken as Chaos, but this seemed like the thing that synergized the most. I did originally experiment a little bit with Fire Rest stacking and melding, but that taxed my damage way more than it gave in defensive benefits, and I still needed to solve both Fizz and Chaos. With just Ellie Flasks alone, I still felt squishy. So I added a Progenesis on top. And because I have a Mage Blood, none of my flasks use charges, except for the Progenesis. So if I have any source of gain of flask charge on crit, such as from my Watcher's Eye, it automatically refills the Progenesis once every 100 milliseconds. This effectively leads to infinite flask uptime, at least so long as my Penance Brands are ticking away. Unfortunately, I do so much damage that there's a good chance the boss is going to be immune in phasing, which does lead to slight lulls in the uptime, but as long as you hit it manually during those times, especially when you're getting hit by big damage, you should be totally fine. The build has a multi-layered cast on damage taken setup, which is pretty darn effective at keeping you alive. The next thing that I wanted to solve was being able to use the haste aura. Not only does it make Penance Brand tick much faster, but it's a great amount of quality of life via movement speed. The problem is, haste, level 21, requires 159 dexterity. And this build is very dexterity starved. So I found the best way to do it is tier 1 or tier 0 essence on my gloves. Then I combine this with suffixes on most of my cluster jewels to get barely enough dexterity. I'm currently at 160 to be able to use a level 21 haste. Now, with a perfectly rolled mage blood, I could have a little bit more dex there and a little bit less elsewhere. And if I had something like a Precursor's Emblem that had dexterity, that would also help. But unfortunately, I didn't end up with either of those things, so dex was very much a problem. And if you run into dex problems for yourself, remember you can have it on the gloves, helmet, mage blood, cluster jewels, precursors. But given how high-end a lot of the gear is, unfortunately, needing a little bit of extra dex here or there could cost you 20 divines, and it could cost you an additional 120 if you're trying to get it on the precursors. So be a little careful of that and solve it sooner rather than later. But even after this, my damage felt a lot better. I was able to blast through maps, and my tankiness still felt lacking. I realized the problem was I didn't have spell suppression. So first I thought, well, I'll just put it in via charms. And you can, but if you just do it via charms, you'll lose out on a lot of other powerful effects like instant leech and reflect immunity. Reflect immunity is an absolute must if you're going to be doing feared, because any reflect from Atziri is going to kill you instantly. And the leech being instant feels really, really good, so I wanted to have it in the build. Thus, I found out that an impossible escape for precise technique let me take a few suppress nodes fairly easily, and I could fill out the rest with a green nightmare. Technically, the green nightmare isn't 100% ideal, but I don't think I could fix this outside of actual perfect gear, or maybe working things around a helmet that's slightly better and has a spell suppression implicit. However, I have no desire to go to Vivid Vulture Prison, so spell suppression implicit will have to wait for someone richer or more foolhardy than myself. And so, after solving all of that, I'm ready to play the build, right? Well, kind of. Except I didn't have enough mana to actually put on all of my auras. Now, maybe this was me being greedy. I mean, I don't think so personally. I was only running Hatred and Haste, and either Zealotry or Wrath. Zealotry ended up being better, and Herald of Ash, and Herald of Purity, and Precision. So that's not that many auras after all. All of these do have to go on my mana. Reserving my life wouldn't really be the best. And unfortunately, I'm not that near many of the aura nodes on the tree. You can solve some of this by grabbing Inspirational and running a banner. How does this help? Well, it gives you extra defenses and it will make you feel better. But I wanted to run Fortitude since that was better defenses, and I could swap Inspirational when I felt like I didn't need the defenses and did need the damage. The banner ended up getting lost in there. So I made sure to start with Sovereignty, and then I tried a Mana Mastery before realizing that's way too many points, and I could get the same effect on a helmet, which is when I tried a helmet with 90% cost and reservation efficiency and +1 power charge. But the stats kind of sucked, and I couldn't effectively use that to get a bunch of life while also capping up my suppress. So I dropped it for rare, which put me back to the problem of needing mana reservation. Thus, I rolled the helmet to have suppression and RMR with Essence of Loathing. This is why I'm using a synthesized base. It has to be item level 85, and oh boy, was it expensive. If you want the budget option, definitely go with Unique with the cost reduction and kind of work out your auras from there. It's doable, but you're probably going to have to use double Enlighten, lose utility skill, and there's a good chance that you will definitely need +1 gems somewhere corrupted on your gear. Since even I did. I had +1 gems corrupted on my Malachai's Loop, which is where I run my 250% auras with an Enlighten 4. So effectively, I'm getting the effects of a level 5 Awakened Enlighten without the 2 mirror cost to actually buy it. I even managed to pick up a shield that has some extra fizz taken as Ellie, which isn't super impactful, but definitely helps. And so with all that solved, the build was finally playable. The only thing that I needed to do was swap between Progenesis and Oriath's End, depending on whether I was clearing a map or killing Uber bosses. And oh boy, was it a dream to play. It took a long time to get all of those complex mechanics in place, and it felt really good. However, at that point, I still felt a little squishier than I'd like. I had pretty good phys reduction, but it wasn't perfect, and so I ended up getting a Precursor's Emblem with +1 to max power charges and 1% physical reduction per power charge. Now, the nice thing about just stacking this raw physical reduction is it stacks with all of my endurance charges. And remember, my maximum endurance charges are equal to my maximum power. Plus, their effect can be enhanced by Enduring Cry. So all of a sudden, I was almost at 90% physical damage reduction, which, unlike armor, does apply to dots, and which, unlike armor, doesn't care about the size of a hit, making me incredibly tanky. And all it cost me was my sanity, since there's a very good chance you're going to have to find your own way to fix it. Spoiler alert, it's really just dropping one of your ores for determination. Kinda sucks to lose the DPS, but I guess at the end of the day, you choose between spending a ton of money, being a little squishier, or losing some DPS. You can't quite have everything that you want. And with that, I began doing exactly what the build was intended to and blasting all of the Uber bosses out of existence. I think the reason that the skill is called Penance Brand of Dissipation is because it makes bosses disappear. Especially when combined with Slayer Cull, I'd look away for a fraction of a second thinking, oh, the boss is at half, it'll take a little longer. Nope, boss is gone instantly and time to collect the loot. So let's begin by taking a look at the skills and passives. I'm of course a Slayer, with Headsman for as many damage bonuses as possible, Brutal Fervor for Overleech, which is really good quality of life and reduced damage taken, and of course Masterful Form to fix physical damage reduction. I'm also a Wildwood Primalist. I'm not really using Might of a Bear, aside of the fact that the inventory is very nice for keeping mapping supplies and stuff, but I am using a Pathfinder's Lupine Charm to cap my suppress and getting some Fizz's extra damage of a random element, AoE per endurance, which is absolutely critical when mapping, along with 6% of Leech's instant, and crit chance while at max power cannot take reflected damage. The crit chance while at max power could be crit damage or any other damage mod, kinda depends on your exact gearing. Cannot reflect is so that I'm Uber Atziri viable. Then coming over here, in my first jewel socket, passives in Radius of Precise Technique can be allocated without being connected. This is how I'm capping out suppress and grabbing a little bit of life. Unfortunately, there's a lot of pathing here, but that's just the price you pay for playing a Slayer. Then I've got Forbidden Flesh. This can either be Fortitude or Inspirational. You'll just have to try them both and see what feels best. Also, Potency of Will ends up being a pretty good cluster. The extra brand duration is not only great quality of life, but it allows your brands to ramp up more smoothly. Coming over here, I've got a Green Nightmare, and this is how I'm capping out my suppression right on Holy Dominion. Then we've got the two clusters, of course, the Militant Faith setup for Inner Conviction, some more brand duration nodes, Storm Shroud to be ailment immune, that which was taken for damage and utility mods. These are somewhat interchangeable with the charms. Just remember, some of the mods are prefixes and some are suffixes. So, for example, the Chaos Resistance per Endurance charge isn't exchangeable with the Area of Effect per Endurance, because that's a prefix for a suffix, but it is with the Instant Leech, or with the Suppression, or with the Reflect Immunity. I've also got a Watcher's Eye, pretty much perfect. The crit chance with Hatred caps out my crit, or very close to it. Then the Gain a Flask charge when you deal a crit. Make sure that my Progenesis or Oriaths is always available when I need it the most. Last up, a Balance of Terror rounds out my year with a massive amount of damage in the form of Fizz's extra of a random element if I've cast Elemental Weakness. Not only is this great for dropping on bosses, but if I'm doing something like Expedition and I accidentally make enemies immune to both lightning and cold, aka all of my damage, well, the proc chance for fire is more than enough to clear the map without even noticing. Okay, that's kind of half true. I do notice, but it isn't really that much of a problem. Now, I know there's been a little bit of a debate on Runebinder. Some people say that it stops your penance brand from ramping up to full. And I have not done any testing on this at all because I have more than enough damage that I don't feel it's relevant. What is relevant, though, is when you have Runebinder and you attach two brands with remarkable clusters, the immediacy of your damage is much higher because your brands are ticking twice immediately, even if they only ramp to 10 stacks. Basically what I'm saying is, this feels better, so I'm keeping it because I have more than enough damage to worry about killing the bosses. They're going to die regardless of what I do. Now, coming over here, looking at skills. In my weapon I have Righteous Fire. This is great for damage, but you do need the Replica Restless Ward or some other massive regen source to actually sustain it. Portal Gem, because I'm tired of clicking portal scrolls this league. And Flame Dash to get around. I also used Frostblink for a while. You can even use Frostblink of Wintry Blast. Kind of just up to you. In my gloves, I've got my Herald of Ash, my Herald of Purity. Yes, that +1 level is actually relevant. Precision, just good old level 1. And Ellie Weakness. The level 21 isn't super relevant, but it means that I can put it in the same links as my cast on damage taken after that hits 20. Not that I particularly want to at the moment, but I wanted a flexibility. Also, I evolved it myself. Zealotry, level 20, still trying to vol at 21. Increased duration for the Blessing. And Enduring Cry with increased duration for the extra Fizz reduction. This takes the base Fizz reduction from endurance charges from 4 to 6 while it's active. In my shield, that Pseudo level 5 Enlighten, Hatred level 21, and Haste, which is hopefully soon going to be level 21, assuming that I get to Vol them all. So far they've all gone down or turned, well, Vol. Then I've got Frost Shield, one of the best, most underrated defensive skills in the game. Steel Skin, this could also be a Mortal Call, kind of going back and forth on both. I have no idea which one's better, to be honest with you, so I'm probably just going to keep swapping back and forth until something feels noticeably different. Cast on damage taken to trigger them, and Hydrosphere. These should all be level 20 pretty soon. Then for Penance Brand, gem levels are important, so Empower 4. Increased crit damage support, pretty darn good if you're a crit build. Power Charge on crit with this many power charges is by far one of the best supports to have. Conk Effect could be something else, I'll talk about that in a second, and Swift Brand is about immediacy. You can use Spell Echo, you can use Faster Casting, you can use Swift Brand, you can use Awakened Added Fire, Awakened Ellie Focus. There's a lot of things that can technically be used instead. None feel nearly as good, even if this means the brand is much shorter and I need to scale brand duration. Ultimately, I was going by feel here rather than by the numbers in POB. Because I'm pretty sure according to POB, you should not have Swift Brand support, you shouldn't have these at all, and you should instead just go max crit and max damage. However, when I compared them, especially when doing tier 17 maps, this setup felt much better to me, so that's what I stuck with. If you want to do different, that's totally fine, just be aware it may feel worse, and you may feel like, even though on paper you have a lot of damage, you're not actually being able to deliver it. In terms of skills and passives, there's honestly not much I'd change. Though, on my passive tree, I could very much see 2 1-passive voices fitting in really nicely. Unfortunately, that's about 3 mirrors less than I have to spend at the moment, so maybe I'll try that at some point in the future. But speaking of gear, let's take a look at some of the items I've made and go over a little bit about how I crafted them. So first up, my clusters. I just bought this one. It was fairly cheap, only a couple divines. And for this one, I rolled it myself. I spammed alts until I got either the prefix and the suffix, or the dexterity and the prefix. Then I regaled. If it hit one of the other mods, cool. And I exalt slammed to finish it. I rolled a whole bunch of these. They're actually reasonably profitable to roll, and there's not too much about it that matters. As long as you have force multiplier on it, you're probably pretty good. For this cluster, Essence Rush plus Arcane Heroism's really good. There's a couple other options. Basically, I want some form of ES Leech, and I want Arcane Heroism for Arcane Surge. The small clusters are very much about quality of life, and you need brand clusters with Remarkable. This gives you a 35% chance to create an additional brand. Now, this one I happen to make myself. Again, just Alt into Aug, into Regal, into Exalt. But the other two with Grand Design are much more difficult to roll, especially if you need specific suffixes, like I did with the Dexterity. So I ended up buying them. They were moderately expensive, though I genuinely don't remember the price. I just don't remember it being anything eye-watering. Then again, this league, that could mean 5 divines, it could mean 1 divine, and it could mean 8 divines. Moving on to the rest of my items, the Void Battery is a Void Battery. If you can get Unholy Might or Penetration, great. If you can't, just use any Void Battery with really high cast speed. For the Replica Restless Ward, you can use a regular Restless Ward, but Replica gives you additional movement speed and more life regeneration rate. Make sure you get Socketed Duration Gems, Level of Socketed Gems, or Socketed AoE Gems for maximum Penance Brand damage. Because the build uses Ralakash's Impatience, then you absolutely need the Ralakashes, and if you want to cap out your Suppress, it needs to be corrupted with 8 or 9% chance. Unfortunately, this could very well get expensive. And if you're wondering why relic caches is so critical to the build, don't worry, I made a dedicated video that goes over that in detail. Link to which will be up in the carding down below. You can check it out after this. Then on the Malachai's Loop, the +1 to level of socketed gems, super important. I wouldn't be able to play the build without it, because I'd be short on the mana reservation. Or I guess I could use an Enlightened 5, but I'm pretty sure a +1 to level of socketed gems is less than the 1 to 2 mirrors that you're going to be paying for an Enlightened 5. By less, I mean way less, because technically these are really cheap to just corrupt yourself. On the Badge of a Brotherhood, the infused anointment is really important and actually cost me more than the item itself, but the cold damage leached as life is also very important. Without it, you'll need to use an elemental damage cluster, lightning damage cluster, or cold damage cluster with elemental damage leached as life. This definitely isn't ideal and makes your clusters end up feeling lackluster. I do think the fizz cluster I have is pretty darn optional. I could swap that to something else, but I'm very happy with the spell damage cluster. Next up, there's the Mage Blood. The dexterity roll is surprisingly relevant. You need 4 magic utility flasks. The resistances don't matter. For my rings, I have this very beautiful Precursor's Emblem. You could use any Precursors with +1 max power charge. You could use any Synth ring with +1 max. Or you could use something like a Circle of Guilt or Circle of Anguish with +1 max. Or alternatively, if you want your rings to be much, much, much cheaper, you could use rings that don't have +1 max power charge on them. This will be a very significant damage loss. And if you don't have something like the additional damage reduction per power charge, a significant defensive loss as well. But the build does function, and I was killing Uber bosses even before I got this upgrade. There were just a few more deaths. Because these rings are rare enough to get one of them as a challenge, I'm just reflecting it with a Calandra's touch. Now, normally I'd be talking about how I crafted items for this build, but unfortunately, because this build's almost all uniques, there hasn't really been much opportunity for crafting. But where I did is these gloves. I rolled them using Essence of Sorrow until I hit the chance to suppress. Starting with a Chaos Res base, and then rolling for Dex and Suppress was the most cost-efficient way to go. However, depending on the price of Essence of Sorrow versus Envy, and the price of a Fractured bases, it might be better to get Fractured Suppression, and roll for either the Chaos Res or the Dex. Or alternatively, it could be cheaper just to buy the gloves exactly as is for a finished item. The way I got the cold damage converted is suffixes can't be changed, Veiled Chaos, Unveil, after you block either fire or lightning conversion. Worst case, if this fails and it bricks the item, you can always use Eldritch and Nulls, because you'll want to fix the implicits in a later step. And after that, I just left the life because at some point I'm going to redo the suffixes to have actual life on there and craft a different mod. For the implicits, you need the fizz damage converted to cold as both an implicit at 20% and an explicit at 30%. That gets you to the 50% conversion to convert most of your penance print over to cold so it scales off of hatred. This is far more powerful than converting to lightning and scaling off of wrath. Technically, in this case, more conversion is better, as it'll skew things a little more towards cold than lightning, but realistically it doesn't matter all that much. Then the other thing I crafted was this helmet, where I spammed Deafening Essence of Loathing for the RMR until I hit Chance to Suppress spell damage. Unfortunately, yet again, this does need to be T1, and because I was working on a maximum power charge base, it was very expensive. After that, I ended up finishing it with a Veiled Chaos for life, and I got T2, I got the Unveil. I crafted some Fizz Taken as Fire. Unfortunately, it does have that really awful T8 strength, but I'm going to be honest, at that point I was just exhausted from using essences and wanted to go on to doing something else because I got relatively unlucky and had to spend a couple hundred of them. It would be much cheaper to use a different helmet, one that isn't synthesized, but does have the RMR and the Spell Suppress without the +1 max power charge. I think the build will be fine, it just won't be quite as effective and won't melt Uber bosses quite as quickly. And so that's all my gear, and the surprising lack of crafting for this build. Normally, crafting a build, for me, is literally about the crafting, but in this case, it was more about the tinkering, making sure that all the unique items came together in a perfect way. And of course, if you want to see the POB as a handy reference, it'll be in my Discord as usual. Just react to give yourself the community and notification role, then head down to the Build Link archive channel. So what about the gameplay? First off, this isn't really made to be a mapper. However, if you put on an Oriath's End, and especially if you don't use Conch Effect, opting for elemental penetration instead. As it turns out, it's a pretty darn good one. You're quite fast due to the additional movement speed per frenzy charge from the replica Restless Ward. And because of a massive amount of cold damage, everything's frozen, it shatters, explodes with the Oriaths, and obliterates the entire screen. So if you want to turn everything to dust before you barely even get to see it, this is actually a great build to do that. In fact, one of the things that I was doing to limit test the build early on was running tier 16 Essence Atlas memories. You know those things that you're supposed to scour and do in tier 1 because the essences are still deadly enough to kill you? Yeah, I was doing those tier 16 and rolling them, which, fun fact, was most of the way towards my challenge to do that. I wasn't even thinking about that at the time, I just wanted to do something ridiculous because I could. If you want to see how that went, by the way, I'll link to the VOD of a stream somewhere around here up in the card description, something like that. After that, I did a bunch of Guardian Invitation rushing, since it was a pretty good way to make money on a boss killer build and it let me get my gear together. In this case, I was still using the Oriaths because none of the bosses were that scary. I was using the Compass that tripled their health and doubled their damage. It wasn't an issue. In fact, I could even Wisp juice them, although at that point they were starting to live for meaningful amounts of time. Which, now that I've seen how long Uber bosses live for, I'm pretty sure some of those Wisp-juiced Guardians had more health than Uber bosses. But of course, this is where I finished my gear and got to the point where I could actually do what I wanted on the build. Tier 17 maps and Uber boss encounters. I've killed every Uber boss that PoE has to offer. The feared die in seconds. The Exarch, if I get lucky and don't have to deal with any ball phases, dies almost immediately. Same thing with Eater. Sometimes I can phase him and kill him instantly, sometimes I can't. There's something very weird going on there in terms of the interaction between my damage pattern and boss DR. I think the solution would technically be straight one-shot him, but as there's a slight ramp-up time here, sadly I can't quite do that. And then there are some of my favorite Uber bosses. Uber Elder, which is really easy to do. You can take hits from most things on the fight, including the slam. Uber Maven, where the only real danger is the memory game, or of course getting the anti-healing beams, but when that happened to me, I didn't actually die, so it doesn't count. And Uber Cortex, which has so little health that it isn't really a boss here. The only Uber that gave me any issues at all was Uber Cirrus, and that just has to do with the fact that I'm pretty darn bad of a fight, and there were a couple things, such as the puddles on the floor, that could actually kill me. And by gave me a couple issues, I mean I instantly phased him, then died after phasing him because I wasn't paying attention, then came back, insta-phased him again, and ended up murdering him, then doing a second run where I played it perfectly and didn't have any issues at all. But hey, unlike a lot of the others where I got it first try, technically the Deathless run took 2. Though I don't think that's really the build, it's more of a reflection of the fact that I don't do the fight enough and kind of forgot about some of the mechanics like the storm spawning before he goes up and summons his projection. In terms of tier 17 maps, some of them are very sketchy, as the mods are absolutely awful. I haven't done any voided ones, nor do I have any intention to for quite a while. But I also haven't failed a single map, at least as of yet. Though, to be fair, I haven't tried some of the super nasty ones like Union of Souls Feared or deal 10% less damage for every item equipped. Ones that, really make you hate your life. I did find that surprisingly this was one of the cases where offense is the best defense, and instead of going with something super tanky like Progenesis, where that noticeably slowed down my clear and also got me killed, I just go with the Oriath for the explodey effects, and I'd also take off my Fortitude for an inspirational Flesh and Flame swap. The additional damage from the Aura effect felt really good here, whereas for most of the rest of the game, I honestly didn't notice it all that much. In general, if you are looking to super min-max, I do think you should swap it. For all the phased Uber bosses, you should use Fortitude. For the non-phased ones, you should use Inspirational, since I've found that's the best way to kill them before they get to do anything. And for any tier 17 map that doesn't either A, require you to be in melee all the time, or B, hyper-limit you defensively, you should probably be using Inspirational, as the damage did seem to matter there. But of course, I could continue to improve a build, get say a 3 mod Precursors, a 3 mod Watcher's Eye, increase some stuff elsewhere, awaken and empower, all that fun stuff, and I'm sure everything would be melting in even less time. Though I also think those changes would be cosmetic rather than meaningful outside of a tier 17 maps. This league, it's kind of hard to have a build and call it an all-rounder capable of doing all content, since a lot of the content is pretty relative, but this is the closest I've played in a while, and I think in terms of every dedicated boss killer I've made in Path of Exile, this is actually the best one. barely beating out the Cast on Crit Forbidden Right build way back in Sentinel League. And so now I'm curious, what's the best build that you've played when you've wanted to kill bosses in PoE? Or have you never made a boss killer before? If that's the case, I'd say this is the best league to do it, as bosses aren't nearly as scary as super wisp juice monsters anyway, so if you can take on those, you can take on an uber boss no problem. If you're looking for something else to watch after this, then you can watch a little bit more on Relic Caches, the Guardian Invitation strategy I recently did, or maybe check out a stream where I limit tested a build. With that said, I'd like to take a moment to thank the patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you can help make videos just like this one possible, and you might even see your name on screen to boot. I know this video did end up being a little longer, but unlike most of the builds that I played, the mechanics were especially intricate, and I really wanted to outline them in detail so that hopefully you can follow along at home if you want to. And so with that said, thanks for watching to the end, I hope you learned something, and I'll see you again sometime soon.